I now call to order the March 13th, 2025 meeting of the Equity Committee of the Board of Education of Baltimore County. In accordance with Board Policy 8311, the Chair of the committee, at their discretion and after consultation with the staff liaison, may convene an in-person committee meeting. Otherwise, all committee meetings will be held electronically. Today's meeting is being held virtually and broadcast through Microsoft Teams. In order to efficiently conduct this meeting, committee members will state their name before speaking. Ms. Siebold, please call a roll of board members to determine the presence of a quorum of the committee.
Good afternoon. Ms. Chikakalu?
Present.
Ms. Harvey?
Present.
Thank you. Ms. Delusky?
Present.
Ms. Frempong?
Present.
Thank you.
Ms. Siebold, please call the roll of staff members on the Equity Committee participating in today's meeting.
Ms. Charlie Green?
Present.
Mr. Handy?
Present.
Thank you.
The first item on the agenda is suspension snapshot, and for that, I call on Mr. Douglas Handy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So good afternoon again to our committee members here this evening with this suspension snapshot. I'll walk you through the data, and then, of course, as always, we'll have a discussion afterwards based on any questions or comments you have. Next slide, please. All right, so first thing I want to point out is that when we look at our suspension data, we typically look at a couple of categories for the data, discretionary versus non-discretionary suspensions. And I'll define those for you as you see here on your screen. So we talk about discretionary offenses. We're talking about the minor nonviolent offenses that impact school climate. And for non-discretionary, we're talking about those infractions that cause physical harm to others and or are illegal. We're also going to look at our data disaggregated by race. So here on this slide, you see a pie chart showing the racial breakdown of our student enrollment as of September 30 enrollment reporting. So you see our different percentages stated here. You will notice that when we get into our data charts, you'll see these racial groups here that you see on the pie chart. Our American Indian and Pacific Islander students, you'll see them in the category of others. So for the sake of the data we'll review, those will be combined as other, and then the other racial categories you will see will be displayed on our charts. Next slide, please. All right, so what we've done is pull together our suspension data, and I'm going to walk us through this particular table. We're going to look at 7 different slides, and they're going to really look very similar to this one. So first thing you'll see at the top, in our top row, you'll see the categories. So 1L, that refers to our student handbook, and the student handbook has the breakdown of Category 1, Category 2, and Category 3 offenses. So 1L is a Category 1 offense, and then L denotes where it is in the list of potential offenses or actions that have occurred. So this one is 1L, and it's refusing to cooperate with school rules and or regulations. You also see to the right on this first row, you'll see the number 524. That's the number of suspensions that have occurred this year, and this data was pulled early this week. So this is recent data. So this has the number of again, offenses that have occurred year to date, if you will. So 524. From there, we get into our grade bands. So you'll see the measure. It'll be the number of suspensions. We look at the grade bands from kindergarten to grade 5. So in this case, it's 37 suspensions that have occurred. We look at the grade band 6 to 8, you have 175 suspensions, and then grade band 9 through 12, 312 suspensions. Our next row has our September 30th, 2024 enrollment. So you have each of the enrollment numbers for the grade band. So 48,013, again, for kindergarten to grade 5, 23,621 for grade band 6 through 8, and 34,352 for grade band 9 through 12. Our next section is race and ethnicity. So again, you have that first measure, which is suspensions. So if you would take the number of suspensions in that row and add those up, you would get 524. Going up to that grade band, going back to that for a minute, if you would add those suspensions across those grade bands, you would also get that total of 524. Back to our race and ethnicity breakdown, you have the suspension number again by racial group. Below that, in the next row, you have again that enrollment. So here you have enrollment by racial category, by racial group. So 41,631 Black students, 18,910 Hispanic students, 31,512 white students, 7,691 Asian students. Remember, we talked about the other being combined with our American Indian and Pacific Islanders, 542, and then two races would be 5,700. This last row for percent, that number is a calculation of the number of suspensions divided by the enrollment of that particular racial group. So going with our first column, Black students, again, we talked about comprise 41,631 students in the district, and there are 277 suspensions that have been attributed to Black students. So that's a percentage of 0.67%. And then you see that carried across the different racial groups. Then we have gender. So again, that same measure, if you add the suspensions for male and female students, you should get that total of 524. And then the enrollment numbers, again, are stated for male and female students. The next section is receipt of special services. So we have those suspension numbers. Please note in this case, when we're looking at our students on an individualized education plan or IEP, students on a 504 plan, or our students who are multilingual learners, if you add those suspensions up, remember that's just a subset of our total student population, so that number would be less than 524. And then that last row, again, you have the enrollment for each of those student groups receiving those services. And then if you move to the right of this chart, you have the top 7 schools for each of these particular offenses we're going to review this afternoon. So in other words, out of that 524 total we talked about, Kenwood High School has 74 of those. Lock Raven Technical Academy has 44, Dundalk High has 34, General John Stricker Middle 34, Patapsco High 30, Perry Hall High 29, and Overley High 27. Okay, so again, you'll notice this is going to be the format for each of our slides. The difference will be the offense that you see at the top of the slide. So again, just to review, this particular slide is about refusing to cooperate with school rules and or regulations. All right, next slide, please. All right, our next slide, again, you'll notice it's 1P, so that means also a category 1 offense. This one is using obscene or abusive language or gestures. Total number of suspensions, 144. And then I'm going to pause to give you time to review the data breakdown within each of these subsections, if you will, of this particular chart. So I will point out again, if you look at our race ethnicity chart, we bolded the percentages. So again, you can see how many of the suspensions are attributed to each racial group. So again, when it comes to this particular offense, using obscene or abusive language or gestures, for Black students, it's the number of suspensions being 77. Dividing that by the enrollment and converting that to a percentage, it will be 0.18%. Hispanic students, 0.11. White students, 0.1. Asian students, 0.07%. Other, 0.18, and two races, 0.14. And then again, you see the top 7 schools for this particular offense. All right, we'll move on to the next slide. So this one is now a Category 2 offense. This one is disruptive behavior that results in the interference with normal school program. You'll notice that this one is totaling 1,420, so it is noticeably higher than the totals for the other 2 offenses that we've reviewed thus far. Please keep that in mind as you look at the percentages that are displayed here with our race and ethnicity categories. So again, you start with the grade band. You can see how it's distributed across the grade bands as far as number of suspensions. Again, looking at race and ethnicity, you can see the number of suspensions for each of the racial groups. Of course, that enrollment is the same from the previous slides, and then you see the percents. So for this one, we're looking at 2.16% of those suspensions. With our Black students, 0.92%, with Hispanic students, 0.74%, with white students, 0.16%, with Asian students, 1.85%, other, American Indian and Pacific Islander, and then 2 races, 1.63%. Next, you can see the breakdown of the number of suspensions for male and female students. And then below that, the number of suspensions for students receiving special services. And then again, in that to the right, you will see the top 7 schools for this particular offense. All right, we'll go to the next slide, please. So our next slide is also a Category 1 offense. We have truancy. You'll notice that there's letters F and G. Those refer to truancy from school and truancy from class, respectively. Actually, hold on just a minute. Let me make sure I got those in the right order. Okay, yeah, so 1F is absence or truancy from class, and then 1G is absence or truancy from the school day. Okay, and again, you see the grade bands. So in this case, no suspensions in our kindergarten to grade 5 grade band for this particular offense. And then moving down to the race ethnicity data, you can see the number of suspensions for each of our racial groups. And then this last row in this section has our percentages again. So in this case, 0.09% with Black students, 0.11 with Hispanic students, 0.03 with white students, 0% for Asian, Pacific Islander, and American Indian, and then 0.04 two races. Next, you have your gender. You see the distribution amongst male and female students for this particular category. And then we have our students receiving special services. And then lastly, the top 7 schools for this offense, which you'll notice it totals at 67 suspensions for this school year. Next slide, please. All right, our next category is for fighting. You'll notice we're into our non-discretionary suspensions at this point. Again, for fighting, you see the total being 1,835 suspensions this year. You can see how those suspensions are broken down across our grade bands, with our middle school grade band 6 through 8 being the largest number of suspensions for this particular offense. Next, you see the number of suspensions by racial group. You have the enrollment for each racial group again, and then last row in this section is the percentages. So 3% with Black students, 1.10 with Hispanic students, 0.74 with white students, 0.43 with Asian students, 1.29% for other American Indian and Pacific Islander, and then two races, 1.81%. Below that, you can see the breakdown between male and female students, with male students almost nearly doubling what you see for female students. And then lastly, next you have our receipt of special services. And then the top 7 schools for this particular offense. All right, next slide, please. Okay. Next, we have drugs, 194 suspensions total for this particular category. You see the breakdown across grade bands, with the largest number of suspensions occurring in that grade 9 through 12 grade band. And then we have our breakdown by race ethnicity, starting with the number of suspensions, enrollment repeated. Then we have our percentages. 0.23% Black students, 0.19% Hispanic students, 0.14 white students, 0 for Asian students, 0.37 for other, and then 0.26 for 2 races. You have the breakdown by gender. Again, you see almost twice as many for male as you do for female, roughly. Next, the receipt of special services. And lastly, you have the top 7 schools for this particular category. Next slide, please. The next category is weapons. 142 suspensions for this category. You can see this across the grade bands. This time you see slightly larger count in middle school when compared to high school. You have the breakdown by race and ethnicity. With 0.2% for Black students, 0.17% for Hispanic students, 0.06 with white students, 0.01 for Asian students, 0 for other, and then 0.14 for 2 races. Next, we have our male and female breakdown of the suspension numbers, and then receipt of special services. Then top 7 schools for this particular offense as well. Next slide, please. All right, so that concludes the snapshot, the high-level view, if you will, of the different categories. At this point, I will turn it over to Committee Chair Ms. Frempong for further discussion or any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Handy. Are there any comments or questions regarding the presentation and the content matter? Ms. Delusky?
Thank you. Thank you for putting together all this really critical data. Can you just talk a little bit about the path in terms of how this data will be used to, make reforms or changes? Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you for your question. So I want to talk about maybe the most recent development around this particular topic. On March 11th, we did the system. Baltimore County Public Schools did distribute a notification around how we do this work together, and understanding that we do have some work to do, how we need to respond to what we're seeing. We started looking at the work that we do as a system, what we ask students and families to do, and then what we're asking our community to do. So the document was in our news posting, was called School Safety is a Shared Responsibility. And I think we're gonna bring that up for review, perhaps. Yeah, Ms. Seabold, are you able to share
Yes,
that?
I'm pulling it up as we speak.
right.
It's just taking a moment, and then I will
Thank you so
reshare
much.
my screen.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. So really, this is a critical part of that work, knowing that we do need to do this work in a collaborative fashion, in a shared fashion. So we talk about, where we are in the school year, being halfway through the third quarter, really an issuing of the reminder that, safety is critical to the operations of our school system, to the well-being of our students, and our staff and our community. So, we want to acknowledge the students, the staff, community members who are adding to that positive and supportive environment and space that we want for each of our students. and then really reminding each of our stakeholders, if you will, what the responsibilities are to foster this type of environment for all of our students. So we start with my role, the schools and school system, your role for students and families, and then our role as a whole community. Again, this is on our website. So, issuing this reminder, making sure it's top of mind for all of our students and other stakeholders is part of our response. We're also looking at the work we do through Research for Better Training. Research for Better Teaching, which is our system-wide effort, at making sure that all of our teachers, all of our staff are focused on high expectations for all students and providing that learning environment, both academically and then also in a sense of, classroom culture and climate. Also, we have, regular data review. Of course, at the school level, we also review it, at the system level. Supports are put in place for individual students. So, we've looked at these numbers and we understand, students are being excluded for school in alignment with, what we've laid out as far as guidelines. So when it comes to supporting those students as they reenter school, that's a major part of the work. We don't want to see students continue these behaviors. Some students may need an additional level of support, so we make sure those are provided as well. So even though we look at the data in the aggregate and quite a few cases, or even look at those student groups, if you think about the individual student, really with an eye on providing each student what they need to be successful, that's the approach that's taken when supporting each of the students who appear in these counts that you see. So really, I would say in general, we do what is necessary to help students. Again, they're still in a learning environment, so we want students to learn and adopt, behaviors that are more conducive to their success. So that's a big part of the work we do as well. Just think about some other resources. Our safety assistance, which you've heard of, heard Dr. Rogers talk about, a big initiative that's paid dividends. So being able to, often intervene with students around issues before they show up in the suspension count. So making sure that, our safety assistants are a part of helping to support students as well. And again, relying on partnerships throughout the greater BCPS community as needed to also provide support.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Ms. Harvey?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Handy and team, for this information. Could we possibly go back to the presentation slide? I think it's slide 2 that gives the breakdown demographics for the system. My question, I think, starts from there.
Okay. We are calling that up right now. Yeah. Is this the correct slide, Ms. Harvey?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, that slide. So when I was looking at the data that you provided, the percentages that you provided were the percentage of incidents by demographic group. But what I was really interested in knowing was the percentage of incidents from the total. So not like 10% of this group committed these actions, but of all these actions committed, or of all these suspensions, this percentage of them were for this group. And the reason why is because to me that shows, that is demonstrative of whether there's a disparity or not in how these suspensions are meted out, particularly in the discretionary category. And so as we were going, I did some quick and dirty math. And while African Americans make up 39.4% of the population, in the discretionary suspensions, they were quite often over 50% of the suspensions, if I did my math correctly. While Hispanics make up almost 18% of the student population. In the discretionary suspensions, I believe they were in those categories over 20%. While white students make up 29% of the student population, they were often under 29% in the discretionary suspension categories. And so please check my math, first of all, to make sure that I did it correctly. But I guess my question is, how are discretionary, the term discretionary means that principals or whomever are making decisions about whether an incident merits this level of consequence. And I'm wondering if the same incident in the discretionary category gets the same consequence across systems and across groups. And I didn't see the number of male to female in terms of what the system looks like, but so I didn't do the math there. But I'm just curious as to what your team and what the system is looking at, particularly in terms of discretionary suspensions, when it appears that those are the ones that are, in particular, there's a disproportionate application of that to African American and Hispanic and Latino students.
So thank you, Ms. Harvey. So a couple of resources. Well, let me talk about the data. We can get you that data. I know you said you were doing some math, so we can get you that data. I do know you mentioned the gender. So the slides did have male and female counts for total, but I think you wanted that broken down, I believe. I got you. I understand what you're asking for. Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to, the system is this percentage male and this percentage female, so that we could compare the proportionality of the consequence to those particular groups.
Okay, got you. All right. Okay. And then as far as what you were discussing around discretionary offenses. So the first thing we have is our student handbook. So the student handbook it's really, designed for students as the audience, so they know their expectations. In addition, there are guidelines for our school administrators to make sure that we're being as objective as possible around these discretionary offenses. So we look to mitigate that disproportionality that you talked about. You also see in the student handbook the code of conduct, which is straight from policy and rule. So students and staff understand that code of conduct and how that will be the guide for student behaviors and also the consequences. Additionally, we have our Research for Better Teaching that I mentioned before, and that really is I guess if you look at when we started, like this school year in particular, did some training for our administrators over the summer. It really is an effort at level setting, again, our expectations in the classroom in general. So we are talking about instructionally, and we're talking about, how teachers respond to disruptions with an eye on keeping students in the classroom for instruction to benefit those students, knowing that our safety of each of our students is a primary focus and concern. So you will see through Research for Better Teaching strategies that do speak to being more consistent around how our teachers are interacting with students in the classroom, particularly when it comes to these offenses that we've talked about here in the presentation. And Ms. Seabold, if you can scroll down, you'll see there's a graphic for a pyramid. I think it's about halfway down. So I know it's a little, I don't know if you're able to enlarge that, but this particular, we call it the map of pedagogical knowledge, but it is a tool around we call it like the repertoire that a teacher would have, what the teacher can call on to create a more conducive learning environment for each of their students. So, with an eye on consistency, and giving teachers the tools and resources to be consistent and how they interact with students is also a major part of addressing that disproportionality that we spoke of. So we also are keeping an eye on disproportionate outcomes and addressing those directly as well. Our school executive directors are a big part of that, working with individual schools, working across the schools they supervise, and also addressing the disproportionality. So I'll just say in summary, as you pointed out, Ms. Harvey, we know we do have disproportionality in some of our data. And we are actively working to mitigate and address that disproportionality.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Are there any other questions from our board members? Ms. Chike-Kalu, do you have any questions?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to find the hand raise feature again, but I had a few questions about the data. Could you go back to the presentation? I think it might have been on the 2D fighting. I think it kind of goes on the kind of same question that board member Harvey was talking about. When I was looking at the schools, a lot of schools kept popping up in terms of consistency with the top 7 schools around multiple issue areas. So I was kind of wondering, for the schools that have more pronounced, especially racial disparities and suspensions, are there kind of any interventions that are currently being explored within those schools to kind of see why there's such a great disparity when it comes to student suspension, and also as it relates to student population and their demographic?
Thank you, Ms. Chike-Kalu. So yes, a lot of that work is, again, of course, the school administrators leading that work, also connecting with their executive directors to pull resources across, our central offices. So, we do have a multi-tiered system of supports team that works with schools in this regard. Again, all this is done in conjunction with the school administrators. There are members of my team who've been involved with some of the work as well, with an eye on equity and cultural proficiency, things of that nature as it relates to any situations. So, number one, you're looking at your, principal, school administration taking the lead and then pulling in resources as needed. And it is ongoing work. So, we're looking at the snapshot, but it is work that continues throughout the year. But I do want to assure you, it's not, it's not done in isolation. There certainly is concerted efforts and responses, and they vary by school. And as you mentioned, like you said, you do see some schools across these multiple categories, and principals are well aware, again, through their regular data reviews. So it's a matter of pulling in additional resources to address the concerns for each school. But there's certainly a response for, you mentioned this particular category for fighting, as well as the other responses. So, very much in tune with what's happening at the school. Community partnerships are a big part of it. We do know that, oftentimes, there are occasions where, community activities seem to spill over into the school environment. And that's why our community partnerships are such a critical piece of what we do as well. So it's working with BCPS staff in addition to those community partners to address, the concerns by need. I do want to, I think, is Ms. Charlie Green still with us? Just want to see if she wanted to add anything to what I've shared so far.
I am, and thank you, Mr. Handy. I just wanted to touch on what you did a beautiful job of sharing, and that is the partnership that we have with communities. If you were to look at community data, we work very closely with the police department, with community schools and community organizations. And one of the things that we find is that schools where there are higher instances of, behavior that, warrants suspension, particularly when we look at non-discretionary suspension, that is aligned with some of the instances in the community that require, police response or other things. And so oftentimes there are myriad approaches to being able to address issues that crop up in school. It's infrequent that the instances that result in fighting or something like that are purely focused on something that happened in school. Oftentimes there are other factors that we need to try to resolve. And so we work closely with, folks who help us to try to do conflict resolution. We work closely with our police partners, our community organizations, community schools have a wealth of resources. Some of these schools are community schools. And so all of those are brought to bear to be able to address schools that, maybe, have a number of incidents that require support. At the system level, certainly one of the things that we are able to do is deploy additional resources should the need arise. And so part of that work that happens with the administrator and the executive directors and their partners is that if it is determined that additional resources need to be deployed, we're able to do that to address those needs. Thank you for inviting me to just share a little bit more, Mr. Handy.
You're welcome. Yeah, thank you, Ms. Charlie Green.
Thank you. Thank you so much for answering that question. And also for another question I had was, can we kind of measure, I guess, the amount of students that have been like kind of repeat offenders, or just is there kind of any data to see which students are repeating it, to kind of see which of these are just one-time offenses versus the number of students who have repeated, and to see kind of what interventions we have in place for them and what have kind of worked to remediate that?
So thank you again, Ms. Chigekalu. We don't have that data right now, but we certainly can compile that data and follow with you on that. And again, we try to bring you an aggregate, so that would be more school level data. But I will look into that and work on pulling that together.
Thank you. And I don't want to put another too much of a burden on staff. And I just wanted to know kind of just even just in the aggregate, just a general kind of snapshot of the amount of suspensions that are related to kind of subjective infractions. So maybe a student who's refusing to cooperate or doing something like that, to kind of see if it's an issue with definition and enforcing, and even perhaps implicit bias when it comes to subjective versus just objective infractions that would be categorized as an automatic suspension because it might be a level 2 or level 3 offense.
So I can jump in. So that's actually one of the reasons why we separate the non-discretionary from the discretionary suspensions, where there is, when it is discretionary, and I think Board Member Harvey pointed out that that's an area of focus, because while there are very specific guidelines, in fact, principals are given a matrix, which kind of says, if this occurs, here are the range of consequences. One of the things that we do as part of our oversight is school teams first, and then followed by executive director teams. And even at the systemic level, we look at consistency across schools. For this suspension, for example, what happened? What is it consistent in terms of how we are following through? And where are we seeing repeat instances? And so the reason Mr. Handy said that it's school level data is that's very much the way a professional learning community works, where the folks at the school look at their data and they say, we've got a group of students who are having multiple offenses. There's an intervention that might need to be tapped. And so perhaps Mr. Handy's team would be deployed, perhaps someone from Ms. Muster's office would be deployed, perhaps some alternative setup needs to be provided to reduce opportunity for things to continue to happen, training perhaps for staff. All of those are the menu of options, but it starts first with the data. And the data is very individualized, because what's needed at the middle school level might be different from the high school level. It might differ whether or not the school is a community school and has some resources they can use, or if the school is not a community school and those resources have to perhaps be brought in or partnered in some way. So there are a number of ways that occurs. And so certainly, as Mr. Handy said, we will try to bring the best and the most representative data back to you. But to your point, Ms. Chekakula, I want to make sure that it is understood that, it is really about meeting student need by the individual level and the aggregate at the school level. Then if you scope out a little bit more at the community level, and then certainly at the systemic level. So at different spaces, we are able to address repeat needs of students and what might need to be put in place so that we can reduce that and keep kids in class and keep them learning.
And thank you so much for that, for answering it. That was a very clarifying question. And just for my last one, just generally, do we kind of know how often restorative practices are used in cases that could possibly lead to discretionary suspensions? And if we have any metrics or way to kind of measure its effectiveness?
So I'll start.
No, please go ahead and start, Mr. Handy.
Okay, so I guess I know as a firm believer in the effectiveness of restorative practices when it's done throughout a school. I think that's critical. So to your point, Ms. Chekakula, yes, where the cases that are successful, again, we don't have that data right now. I will investigate to see, because of course that's going to, look at the quantitative data and then, interact with our different school principals around, what they're using to actually bring about effective outcomes, as you mentioned. So I will look into that. We do actively offer professional development around restorative practices. Again, it's something that we have invested in and continue to do so as a system to build capacity of staff to apply restorative practices. But I'll investigate the data to see where we are now, see if I can bring some information back to you.
And thank you, Mr. Handy. And the only thing that I would add to that is, obviously, when done well and done as part of the school-wide regular practice, those students don't actually hit the suspension data. So that's data we'd have to mine from FOCUS, which is our system of kind of looking at referrals and perhaps, trying to look at what the initial behavior was, the intervention that was applied, and then, juxtapose that with places where perhaps there was not a similar practice, and to be able to try to come up with something that at least accurately reflects the success. But Mr. Handy, I know he and his team are actively engaged in that work, so he is well suited to be able to bring back something that tells a true picture of what it looks like when it's done well.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So this is Board Member Frimpong, and I have a few questions. My colleagues did ask some of the questions that I had, so thank you guys for that. I think we're all on the same page. But again, tying into, and maybe it's been said kind of across the different questions, but I guess if we had to summarize, I would like to understand, like, what are the not reactive, but what are the preventative measures that are being put in place to help the students? And then what is the checks and balance when we talk about how the discretionary suspensions are being applied?
So thank you, Ms. Frimpong. I'll start off. So really just to reiterate around the resources provided. So the handbook is a major part of the work we do. Again, the matrix that's now a part of that handbook, really giving school leaders and staff guidance on how to respond to behaviors is a major part of that handbook. Linked to the handbook, again, is our code of conduct for students by policy and rule to provide that guidance. And then, the work we're doing, Research for Better Teaching, is really designed to provide more consistency across classrooms. So again, understanding that we've had a disproportionality, really looking to focus on Research for Better Teaching, which I do think is a strong complement for restorative practices. As Ms. Charlie Green mentioned, really when done, I would say to fidelity, or done with, starting with that community building aspect, so making that part of a school culture. So it's not something that you're going to be able to do overnight, so to speak, but when you start to build that culture with restorative practice as a key part to it, you'll see, I believe, results over time as well. So, again, as a system, we continue to provide professional learning around restorative practices. And then, again, our multi-tier system of supports team is a big part of, responding to the different concerns that schools may have around this work. So it is, again, it's ongoing work. Just like you all pointed out, we see schools that, appear to have greater needs than others, and you start to see student groups having greater needs. And as Ms. Charlie Green mentioned, we look at all resources available, how to respond to those. So again, looking at the handbook as a start, the message that was sent out about safety being everyone's responsibility, also talking about the handbook and making sure we stay connected as a community. So really being responsive as we go throughout the year is another big approach to how we try to respond and address the concerns that we've been talking about.
And I would add, in terms of checks and balances, because I did hear that part of your question, those ongoing and regular data reviews are how we are able to say, so how's it going? We say we're going to do all of these things on the front end. What is the net result of that? And so we look at data. We look at data by individual student group. We look at data across schools, but we also look at trends. What are we seeing at a particular school? And is that suggesting to us that we need to provide that school with additional support? We also make certain that we are not just looking at it in terms of, the overall aggregate for the system overall, but looking at grade bands and then working with our community partners to see what it looks like in the community and what are those incidents that are occurring there and how can we partner with them to provide information to communities as a whole. So, these are things that typically occur, either, after some sort of disciplinary action has taken place, but it is a check to make certain that we are doing what it is that we said we were going to do, and course correcting if needed. If, something that we put in place we thought would be effective is really not having the impact that we thought, it's an opportunity to change. And it's also an opportunity to redeploy resources to places where they're not needed, to places where they may be most needed. And so differentiated support to all schools to make certain that we're getting people what they need is a key component. Our elementary schools, as you can see from the data, do need some support, but perhaps not at the same level. So being able to add in positions with our safety assistants and our team leads and the rovers that go from school to school allow those schools to have some support, but allow us to put more concentrated support in other areas. So all of that comes from regular data review. And so I would just say that the check really is the constant monitoring and then being able to share that data out and course correct as needed.
Thank you. And then with the data review, because you also talked about with the PLCs, is there, I guess, when I also talk about a checks and balance, is because there are other schools working with each other, are other schools, I guess, able to even give, or I guess provide feedback or something perhaps that maybe, um, the original school is not seeing? Meaning sometimes when you're in something, it's harder to see versus when you can have that independent perspective, but it is their peer. So is there, I guess, some type of checks and balance with that as well? Are they part of that checks and balance, or is it specifically just left to the administrator of the school?
So there's a PLC at the school level, which is the administrator and the school leaders, who would be perhaps in middle school, it would be, for example, the 6th and 7th grade, leaders, as well as the content area leaders, and high school, corresponding leaders there. But all school leaders are part of a PLC that meets monthly. When we have our monthly meeting with school leaders, part of that day is set aside for PLC time, where they're able to meet not only with their colleagues level alike at times, but also with their feeder pattern and identify trends they're seeing in the community around climate, around instruction, around a number of different topics. And there is a cycle of topics that they review, that they go through their data. And so that is key. We also, from time to time, will highlight school leaders who are doing things that are, extraordinary in their schools. And that's part of that time where they're able to hear from their colleagues about schools that are similarly situated and how they're doing that work. So they are involved. And I would think that probably one of the things we have done, and this is through the diagnosis of the team. So the team comes in, they do a little bit of a huddle, and they decide that maybe a climate walk, for example, would be something that needs to, just be implemented. And so then we would have multiple folks from central office, as well as, other leaders from other areas come in and just kind of walk through the building, look at things, and then come back and have an informed conversation about what they saw. I know that Mr. Handy and his team is engaged in that work. And so in that way, we're able to make sure that success isn't limited to one building. People are able to learn from one another. It's every school doesn't do it. Every school does it monthly as part of their PLC. Every school may not necessarily have a climate walk, but it's one of the menu of options we can put in place when schools have needs, so that they're not trying to do it all on their own and they're learning from their peers.
Thank you, Ms. Charlie Green. I think that's fantastic, as well as, again, we hear about, in your response, we also hear about how central office staff is important in supporting the work that's being done in the schools at the building level. I do have a couple of questions again about the data itself. So for slide number, I believe it's 2, but it's the slide with the population. Um, just so that there's clarity, because I think it threw me off at first. I think it with this slide, the picture on the left maybe should say something about that pie is representing um, student population. Just originally when I first looked at that slide, I was connecting it to trying to connect it to the discretionary and non-discretionary. So just for some clarity, I think it would be helpful if we added that to that particular slide. And then, and I'm sorry, you guys, if I'm not sounding great, it's because I don't feel great. Um, the other thing is we talk about the work being done at the buildings. It was interesting to see the trend for just about across all of the offenses that as you traverse from elementary to middle to high school, that the numbers kept getting bigger. Um, but the one exception in particular was the fighting at the middle school level. So again, I guess when I'm asking kind of about preventative, if we're seeing this as the data that in middle school, that there is a increase of fighting. And then even for the top 7 schools, 6 of those 7 schools are middle schools. Are there plans or um, I guess what things are being put in place? And now I guess I'm thinking more from the perspective of SEL, because I don't know that I wouldn't think that students just go to school and decide, oh, I'm going to fight, but something has happened or something has been building up. And, when we talk about any of these um, incidents, it's about students unfortunately making poor choices. And so what type of things, as far as, again, preventative, are being put in place to help students maybe on that SEL side so that they're not just aware of what the actions are supposed to be, as we talk about in the code of conduct, but how, if we're having some issues, how do we still make sure that we're making those good choices?
Thank you, Ms. Frempong. So, as you pointed out, and the research, bears this as well, that, our students do need high degrees of SEL support at the middle school. So, we are organized by middle school, if you will. If you look at our executive directors, we have, executive directors of schools focused on middle schools. As Ms. Charlie Green talked about, we do provide opportunities for principals, middle school principals, to work together, in those professional leadership development meetings and discuss, strategies to address the needs you talked about. We do have SEL teachers in middle schools, so we do have, staff focused on SEL support, and again, we bring in that additional support, that we talked about before. So we do, want to number one acknowledge, as you mentioned, as the data shows, that there is a need to provide additional supports at middle school. So mentoring is a big part of that. If we go back to the mentoring programs we started a few years ago for Black boys, We started those in middle school, really for the reason you stated around what we're saying as far as our data around middle school. We've also, put some programs in place for our girls in the middle school as well, some of our Black girls. So mentoring is a big part of that. Again, showing students the positive behaviors, modeling that for students, whether it could be, even their high school, fellow high school students or high school students within the feeder pattern. Again, the mentoring is a big part of that as well. So we are, being responsive to the needs of the individual schools and, acknowledging that, the need is there. Advisories is another big part of it. If you look at our middle school schedule that we implemented this year, we made sure that an advisory period was part of that. Again, for the reason you stated, knowing that we need to provide direct instruction, be proactive, do the work up front, if you will, around what we expect of students, modeling that for them, showing them better ways of being, if you will, giving them demonstrations of what it looks like when a student is meeting expectations. So we are continuing to be responsive to what we've seen with this data, and we'll continue to do that. But I do want to, again, emphasize that advisory period, which is an example of what we've done at the middle school in particular, knowing that the needs are there. So that's been a major component.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And
Welcome.
then the last question, it ties into what Ms. Harvey was talking about as far as how the data was presented, but I'll make it very specific as far as something that I was looking for with the data, and that is our risk ratio. And it's just another way of showing how um, if something is truly proportionate. So we've seen in previous reports, for example, with suspensions, that in particular one student group, Black boys, was at a much higher rate compared to their peers. And so if we're talking about a risk ratio that's below 1.0, we know the risk is lower. If it's higher, then we know it's just proportionate, versus if it's just one, then it's proportionate. So that was something that previous reports looking at this type of data, if that information was provided. And so I think that would be helpful if we're able to see that information on that type of breakdown as well. And so it ties more into also what Ms. Harvey was saying as far as how does this population compare to their peers? We're seeing it within is what you've shown us, but also across the board. So be helpful to see that information as well. And that is my last comment slash question.
Thank you, Ms. Rampong. And so thank you. We will look to address what you've mentioned and what Ms. Harvey mentioned to give a clear picture. Again, we certainly acknowledge that the disproportionality exists. As you all brought through the discussion, we want to be responsive in the needs that our students are displaying. I mean, these behaviors are a form of communication, frankly. So do want to acknowledge that we know we are disproportionate, and we will look at some data sets that we can bring you to be responsive to what you and Ms. Harvey have asked for as far as taking a look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Handy, and thank you again for answering all of our questions and the thorough presentation that you've put together today. And thank you, Ms. Charlie Green, for being a part of this meeting as well and answering our questions. I will try to do one last search to see if there are any other questions from my fellow board members. And I'm not seeing any hands raised or any notes. I heard someone. Was there another
Yeah.
question?
Yes, I'm sorry. I still can't find where to raise my hand, but I just had when you were talking about when you were answering Ms. Frempong's question, I was just wondering if we're kind of tracking like re-entry impact data for students returning from suspension. So I know you really emphasize community needs and support in terms of like school safety assistance and just the well-rounded student. And so in terms of measurable like post-suspension supports, whether it's academic, mental health, social, have we kind of evaluated which strategies are kind of most effective in supporting students after suspension and kind of just what's working on a system-wide scale for students coming back from whether it's short or long-term suspension.
So I'll start, Mr. Handy, if you don't mind. So we have tracked what's working, and what's working is really a comprehensive strategy of the reentry plan. Students returning from suspension, having a meeting, where applicable, particularly where we're talking about non-discretionary suspensions, completing a contract or, a form of a contract with a student where needs are identified, barriers to success are identified, short-term plans, check-in procedures, all of those kinds of things are put in place based on what the student presents with and, all of the circumstances that led to the suspension. So in terms of what works in particular, whether it's a check-in, check-out, whether it is, some other form of intervention, maybe having a trusted adult they can go to, having a flash pass, any of those things. We don't have data because it's very student specific on which one of those strategies works, but I can tell you in the aggregate what does work is having a plan when a student returns that describes in detail what will happen when a student finds themselves facing whatever triggers led to their suspension in the first place. And so some of the things I mentioned, and I know I'm leaving off countless others, but some of those things I mentioned really do come up in the reentry meeting where what is, kind of chronicled is let's identify what led to this. Let's identify how we can make certain that these things do not land you in the same place next time. What can we do to support you? And here are some things that we can put in place so that students are successful. So we do see that when those are created with the student and the parent involved, and there's follow through on that we do see greater success in those situations. And there, in every individual situation, there may be other mitigating factors that have to be managed as well. But I would think the one thing that I would hold up as a success, a tool of success, would be that reentry meeting and then subsequent contract.
Thank you so much for answering my question. That was my only question.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Ms. Chike-Kalu. So again, thank you to everyone. I think it's helpful, of course, with the data, we see where we're starting, but the and we see how this is an impact on school safety and climate. But as these things continue to be implemented, we also I would think this would also have an impact on our student outcomes because the students are in school instead of being out of school for suspensions. And so it's also the opportunity to improve the student outcomes. So this is a very important topic. So again, I thank you to everyone for putting this information together and answering our questions about it. And so the last item that is on the agenda is announcements. And the next Equity Committee meeting with the Equity Council is scheduled for Thursday, March 27th, 2025 at 5:30 p.m. The next Equity Committee meeting is scheduled for Thursday, April 10th, 2025 at 4 p.m. So is there any further business? All right. So hearing none, the meeting is adjourned. Thank you for joining us and have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
you.
Have a
Have
good
a good-
evening.
Thank you.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Good night, everyone.
I hope you feel better, Ms. Frimpong.
Thank you, Mr.
Feel better.
Liskey. Thank you.